Have you ever thought about buying or selling commercial real estate in Georgia? Well, today's episode's for you. Welcome to the Real Estate Game Plan Podcast, where we bring you inspiration, actionable steps, and knowledge to build your game plan to take your real estate business to the next level. My name is Demo.
And I'm Derek, and we are licensed real estate brokers and your hosts for this podcast. Let's get started.
If you've ever thought about buying or selling commercial real estate in Georgia, our agents just went through a 3-hour CE class with Seth Wiseman. And so we have some great notes from that class, and we're going to talk about those topics today. And Derek's going to be kind enough to lend his knowledge to answer these questions. So let's get right into it, Derek.
All right, I'm excited. So we're super lucky here in Georgia to have Seth, and so much great information.
Certainly.
And one of the things that I loved about his class, and this is actually how he opened it, was he threw out the question, can you name the big differences between residential and commercial? And it's more than what you may think, even though in Georgia you don't have to have a separate license technically to handle commercial, but they are two different galaxies, so to speak.
Yeah, we get that question a lot. I think, like you said, that first main point right there, a lot of people say, where do I go take a test? Where do I go sign up for, commercial? How do I start, right? So We're going to get into some big things today. Number one we're going to start with is, what is a letter of intent and why is it popular in commercial real estate?
Yeah, great question to start out with. So a letter of intent, LOI. So if you've never done commercial real estate before, you've probably not heard of it, and it can be confusing, absolutely, to me the first time that I heard it. But basically what it is a summary of the key terms and conditions that the parties intend to enter into in a formal contract, a formal agreement. It is not intended to be binding on the parties, so that may sound a little bit strange, but it really is more or less a game plan as to what the parties intend to do. Now, it's not something that, as a broker, a LOI is not something that I see with every commercial transaction, more with the bigger ones. But really the thought process behind it was, before we go to the trouble to pay an attorney, because with commercial, it's not uncommon for parties to actually hire an attorney to write their contracts specifically for that transaction. So before we go to the trouble to have an attorney who we're paying hourly, most likely to write this contract, let's at least make sure that we're on the same page with the basic terms. So that's really a little bit of the history and the purpose behind a letter of intent.
So maybe in the residential world, it's kind of like the phone call or the verbal negotiations before we write it onto an offer. This is just a more formal way of doing it, because in commercial world, there can be so many different varieties.
Correct. And one thing Seth said too was that in commercial, it is different from residential in the respect in residential, you may just make an offer right after you show the property. It's a lot more common in commercial to have some communication back and forth between the agents.
Before the start. That makes sense. All right. Number 2, seller has no duty to voluntarily disclose anything, even structural issues. So huge difference, right?
Huge difference, and it's a true statement. So essentially, commercial buyers and sellers, tenants, landlords, are considered to be more sophisticated than residential. So duty to disclose latent or hidden defects doesn't exist in commercial, is one thing that Seth pointed out. Now, an interesting thing on that too, piggybacking on disclosure, is that because of that, it's possible that a real estate agent may have a higher duty to disclose in a commercial transaction than the seller or the landlord, because our laws in Georgia don't differentiate between residential and commercial.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So you still, even as the agent, have to be fully engaged, understand what's going on, and disclose where necessary.
Correct. As licensees, we should be truthful, or if it's in a matter that we aren't at liberty to speak on based on our client asking us not to speak about it. Not something that interferes with law, but if someone asks us a question, we have a duty to be honest. If there is a latent or hidden defect that we know about, technically we still have a duty to disclose it, which is why Seth mentioned that a lot of commercial listing agents don't ask a lot of questions of their sellers because they may not always want to know all of the details.
Sure. What about this one? Do buyers employ home inspectors or surveyors in the commercial buying aspect?
Absolutely, they do, but it's not home inspector. It would be a building inspector. Super important to do that. In commercial, typically the due diligence period is substantially longer than it is in residential. Residential, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, depending on, how the market is going.
Yeah.
In commercial, 30, 45, 60, 90, just depending on what the property actually is and what type of inspections and tests need to be done. But surveys are very important.
Yeah.
I mean, even land, maybe it is residential land, maybe it's commercial land, but not only just a basic boundary line survey, but Seth talked about the ALTA survey, and he mentioned that is the most comprehensive type of survey, and it's what he recommended for commercial. It should reveal easements and so forth on the property, not just your basic boundary lines.
Yeah, and also on the inspection side, I know he was talking about the opportunity for asbestos and all of these different things, structural, issues where an engineer might need to come in. So way more than what you would see on a residential side in a typical fashion, right? Most of the times, especially single-family detached residential, you got your main systems. They're typically very similar in each property. But in commercial, it can be really anything.
It can be anything. And he mentioned phase 1 and phase 2 environmental testing. So there are
fire codes, all that stuff, right?
All sorts of tests that you can do. But with that due diligence period, buyers are really going to look into anything and everything, which they do in residential as well.
Sure.
But in commercial, they really lump it all into that due diligence period.
Yeah. And a lot of times we could be talking about $1 million facilities. So it could be an even bigger investment for that company. All right. What about this one? What about the differences in financing contingencies, earnest money, the basics of contract terms?
Good question. So those are bundled typically within the due diligence period in commercial. So another reason why it's going to be longer. Is there going to be higher amounts of earnest money? Generally, yes, because typically with commercial, you're dealing with higher sales prices as well. GAR, the Georgia Association of Realtors, does not have financing contingencies for commercial. And this is why. It's because buyers typically take care of it within the due diligence period. So a lot of agents, when they're new to commercial, they're looking through the forms library and they're looking for those commercial financing forms, and they don't exist.
Right. And so just because they don't exist doesn't mean you can't put that into the offer, right?
You could certainly add a special stipulation to the contract, but if the due diligence is healthy enough, you really shouldn't need to.
Got to take care of it then. Yep. All right. Next one. Are title objections handled differently in commercial than residential?
They are from a contract standpoint. So one thing that Seth highlighted was in residential, technically you have the entire life of the contract through closing to raise your hand and object to title issues and so forth. That would prevent the seller from conveying good marketable title. With commercial, those contracts are set up with a time frame that as the agent you're going to fill in a blank. And really important to have a strong closing attorney like Weissman, who is going to go ahead and perform title in the beginning and not wait.
Yeah, that's critical for sure. All right, next one. GAR's exhibits for seller warranties and representations. Is that common in the commercial world?
So maybe common for buyers to ask for it, but from what I understand, very uncommon for sellers to provide it. Now, GAR does have the exhibits, and there's a lot of options on there to check, but most of the time, sellers simply aren't going to provide all of that information, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing. Speak with the listing agent. A lot of times, listing agents will get with their seller, and they'll counter back to provide certain things, but not everything. So if you are having that conversation with the listing agent pre-formal offer, that might be something to ask about. Say, what information would the seller actually have? I'm looking at the exhibits, etc.
Sure. So it's always a good idea to ask if you're on the buy side, but not necessarily a requirement that the seller give everything.
Correct.
All right, next one. Is it a red flag if the seller won't agree to complete those exhibits?
No, because it's so common for sellers not to provide it in commercial. Huge contrast to residential, right? In residential, Most real estate transactions, which we could debate this, but most sellers do provide a seller's disclosure statement or the condensed seller's disclosure statement that Georgia agents have access to through the GAR forms. Terrific form if it's an investor or someone who's never lived there. Again, doesn't have to be all or nothing. So.
Sure. That makes sense. Okay, what about the next one? Custom contracts. Does an attorney always have to be involved when they're writing this, or can they just go find a library of forms and go to town?
It depends on the complexity of the transaction. It's not uncommon for parties to have attorneys represent them and custom build contracts for them. Now, agents here in Georgia do have access to the Georgia Association of Realtor contract forms, and there is a whole fleet of commercial forms. Some local associations of realtors, if you are a realtor, will also have their own commercial contract forms. There are some of those in the Atlanta area for sure, but a lot of times they do multi-million-dollar transactions, a lot more common. Think about it. These parties are spending a lot of money and having a contract that truly represents all of their needs is very, very important.
It's kind of like having insurance.
Yes.
Small premium to protect a larger asset.
Yes.
All right. I think this is the last one I have for you. What about searching for commercial property? Can you just go in the MLS, look in commercial, find everything you want there?
So interesting thing. So the MLS does not require commercial properties to go in. So for that reason, sometimes you'll see them in there, and a lot of times you won't. What I found is you typically see light commercial in the MLS, but true commercial you're going to see on commercial MLS websites. For example, LoopNet.
And CoStar.
CoStar, Showcase. There's a whole fleet of commercial websites out there. LoopNet and CoStar are going to be two of the most popular ones for commercial properties.
And very expensive.
And so if you are going to list commercial property, how am I going to promote this property to my best ability and to the advantage of the seller? Those are things to think about. And, of course, searching on behalf of a buyer as well.
Certainly. All right. What about a scenario where there's large vacant land with the idea of building apartments, zoning, all of those type of things? What legal obligations does the new owner have to correct? Maybe if they were in an instance, they bought it, they didn't realize the things were disclosed or not disclosed. Essentially, I guess not disclosed in this scenario. What does the new owner have to do to be able to remedy any of that?
Well, this is a case where Seth really recommended that phase 1, potentially phase 2, but that phase 1 environmental test to be done, because supercharged buyer beware when it comes to commercial again, and it would be the responsibility of the buyer. And just a couple notes that I made on that was new owner has legal obligation to correct. And Seth gave an example of a toxic waste dump and said, you know what, the lender may want an environmental phase 1.
Wow.
And it can generally tell, what the property's been used for over the past 100 years. So it's kind of like a scan of that property.
Sounds like that. If you've already purchased the property, that is potentially extremely expensive, regardless when you've purchased it. But if you have to remedy it and you weren't preparing to remedy it, potentially
absolutely
tons of money.
And certainly I've heard that phase 2 is much more expensive than phase 1. But Seth also mentioned that it all depends. That's not always the case.
Yeah.
But they're not cheap.
Yeah. So anything else? Any closing thoughts on this class summary that we've had with Seth on commercial versus residential real estate?
It was a wonderful class. I really enjoyed it very much. I know the Solid Source agents that were there enjoyed it as well, because Seth really broke it down to a beginner level. And most of us started out in residential. We did residential sales, probably resale, some new construction here and there. And if we haven't done commercial, or if we haven't done it on a regular enough basis, these were some good reminders and just great information.
So what would you say to an agent who has never done a commercial transaction, but is saying, hey, I have a friend or someone I know who wants to buy a commercial building? Where should they start? What should they do? Let's talk about a Solid Source agent.
Sure. Well, I think a Solid Source agent, we do invite you and ask that you reach out to the broker team. So we have a process for handling commercial transactions, because they do inherently carry with them greater risk and greater liability, if for no other reason than commissions, because sales prices tend to be more. So, and if you've never done commercial before, I really want you to reach out to me. We want to look at the drafts of these contracts.
Yep.
We do want to have our eyes on that. Now, in Georgia, I'll just throw in too, right, that we have a duty to disclose to a party that we're working with, to a client, if something is beyond the scope of services we offer or is in an area that we're not experts in. And so it is important for that client to understand that, hey, Derek hasn't done any commercial transactions. He's happy to help me, and he is going to get some advice from his broker.
Yeah.
That would be something that they should know.
Certainly. And the great thing here is that we do have people like Derek who can help, also 2 full-time in-house attorneys here. So we are well stocked and able to help if you do have that question, especially as a solid source agent. So Derek, any closing words here?
And Weissman, our partners and preferred closing attorney, they have attorneys that specifically focus on commercial, and when there's an issue, when there's a problem, they're great at reaching out to the client, to you, to us. So they are a wonderful partner to have in that transaction as well. Certainly.
We definitely appreciate Wiseman, and we appreciate you watching and listening today, and hope to catch you next time. You've been listening to the Real Estate Game Plan Podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe on YouTube and leave us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.